Menace to Society is a raw and unflinching portrayal of life in South Central Los Angeles during the 1990s, a time marked by systemic inequality, gang violence, and the devastating effects of the crack epidemic. At its center is Caine, a young man who embodies the tension between circumstance and choice. While it's clear that Caine was deeply shaped by his environment, his decisions ultimately led to his downfall, putting not just himself, but those around him at risk. From the beginning, Caine's life is defined by violence and instability. The film opens with him witnessing his father's criminal lifestyle and his mother's heroin addiction. This traumatic upbringing placed him at the heart of a cycle of violence and neglect. Studies on intergenerational trauma, such as those by clinical psychologist Dr. Joy DeGruy, explain how systemic oppression and community violence perpetuate destructive behaviors across generations.
We're not talking about a specific event. We're talking about generations of trauma with no intervention. Based on what I know about sugar plantations, tobacco, and the Caribbean, what I know about American chattel slavery and the plantations there, does anyone right now ever recall mental health assistance to slaves? Anybody remember sending in the therapist after I sold off your son, daughter, raped folks? At any point? Never. Second question. After slavery was officially over, now you're free. Anybody remember any therapy then? We know it's been rough, it's been deep for you, it's been difficult. We're going to do a little group therapy. Anybody remember that? That would be no. Number 3, after slavery officially ended, both in the States, in the Caribbean, the British ended, do you remember whether or not trauma continued? Did the trauma continue for people of African descent? I need to know. Okay, so now let's do the math. Hundreds of years of trauma, no treatment. Freed, more trauma, no treatment. What do you do the math? Do you think there may be residual impacts of that trauma? Of course there is. It didn't end, friends, and it hasn't ended yet.
Yet, despite these challenges, Caine wasn't without positive influences. His grandparents provided a stable home grounded in religion and structure, and they represented an escape from the chaos of the streets. However, Caine rejected their guidance, rebelling against their rules and choosing instead to emulate the gangsters who groomed him. This reflects sociologist Elijah Anderson's theory of the code of the street, which argues that young men in marginalized communities often adopt hypermasculine personas as a survival mechanism.
Legal businesses, you either operate your own business, or you work for someone, or illegal, where you do drug trades or steal whatever. Those are the only 2 ways you make money in this country when you break it down.
Drugs are everywhere and guns are everywhere. It's easy to get drugs. Like you go to any corner out and get drugs, like almost any corner.
Things get bad, I stand on the corner of a block and sell drugs if I had to. It's not something that, oh yeah, I'm proud of this. Yeah, look at me, I do this. It's just literally a way of life.
What kind of money do they make? I mean, standing on the corner.
If you're doing it right, you can make like $1,500 a day.
Manhood. If you're a man and you feel no hope, or you sense no future, you become destroyed as a person, then you don't care what happens to you. If you don't care what happens to you, you certainly don't care about people around you.
When I respect you, you're nothing. You have to be respected.
You have to respect.
You have to be respected.
Street credibility is essential, and street cred is high maintenance.
In Caine's world, respect is earned through displays of dominance, violence, and fear, and rejecting this code often leads to social isolation or victimization. Caine's choices were also heavily influenced by his peers. His closest friend, such as O-Dog, normalized criminal behavior and desensitized him to violence. O-Dog's infamous convenience store robbery early in the film is the prime example of how easily acts of violence were treated as casual or even humorous within their group. Social learning theory, as proposed by Albert Bandura, explains how behavior is modeled and reinforced within peer groups. For Caine, his association with Old Dog and others in his circle made it nearly impossible to break away from the street life. At the same time, Caine displayed behaviors rooted in toxic masculinity. He equated manhood with violence, sexual conquest, and a refusal to take responsibility. This is evident in his relationships, where he engages in unprotected sex and denies responsibility for a potential child, ultimately leading to violent retaliation from the woman's cousin. The irony of Caine's life is that while he sought to protect his pride and image, his actions repeatedly endangered the people closest to him. For instance, his criminal lifestyle could have brought retaliation to his grandparents' home, but instead, it was Ronnie's house, a place of refuge for him, that was targeted. This demonstrates the collateral damage of living a life steeped in violence and disregard for consequences. Caine wasn't without opportunities to change his path. His friend Sharif, a devout Muslim, and even his teacher urged him to seek a better life. Ronnie, too, represented a chance at redemption. She envisioned a future for herself and her son away from the violence and despair of Compton. Now, I don't agree in the age gap and the fact that was his friend's girl, but on the other side, she did present a choice for him to leave Compton. Now, I'm not saying he necessarily had to be with her, but they could have left as friends. However, Caine's inability to embrace these opportunities speaks to the internal conflict many young men face when caught between survival and the possibility of change. Bell Hook's work on Black masculinity provides insight here. She argues that systemic racism and patriarchy create a distorted sense of manhood in Black men, where proving one's masculinity often involves rejecting vulnerability and compassion.
Many of the critics who've written about masculinity suggest that we need to do away with the term, that we need an end to manhood. Yet such a stance furthers the notion that there's something inherently evil, bad, or unworthy about maleness. The crisis facing men is not the crisis of masculinity. It is the crisis of patriarchal masculinity. Until we make this distinction clear, men will continue to fear that any critique of patriarchy represents a threat. To offer men and women, boys and girls, a different way of being, we must first replace the dominator model with a partnership model that sees interbeing and interdependency as the organic relationship of all living beings. Love cannot exist in any relationship that is based on domination and coercion. When men embrace feminist thinking and practice, which emphasizes the value of mutual growth and self-actualization in all relationships, their emotional well-being will be enhanced. In the partnership model, selfhood, whether one is female or male, is always at the core of one's identity.
For Caine, admitting he needed help or that he could change would have meant challenging the very identity he had constructed for himself. To understand Caine's story, it's important to consider the social and historical context of Los Angeles during this time.
I will tell you, Director Deutsch, as a former Los Angeles police narcotics detective, that the agency has dealt drugs throughout this country for a long time.
The 1980s and 1990s saw the rise of the crack epidemic, fueled by systemic neglect and economic disenfranchisement in Black communities. According to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, Black Americans were disproportionately targeted and incarcerated during the war on drugs, which sentences for crack cocaine offenses being 100 times harsher than for powder cocaine. Gang culture also surged during this period, with organizations like the Bloods and Crips becoming powerful forces in neighborhoods like South Central. A 1992 report by the LAPD estimated there were over 150,000 gang members in Los Angeles County alone. For young men like Caine, joining a gang or adopting this lifestyle often felt like the only option for survival. And it's often implied that Caine was probably a Crip because of the color blue that he often wore. Nonetheless, Caine's story ultimately ends in tragedy. His death feels inevitable given the choices he made. His refusal to take responsibility for his actions, whether it was denying a child he fathered, retaliating with violence, or putting others in harm's way, sealed his fate. Ironically, Caine's final act was one of redemption, protecting Ronnie's son as the drive-by unfolded. Yet this moment of sacrifice came too late to undo the damage he had caused. This life serves as a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of living by the code of the street. Menace to Society is a powerful exploration of systemic injustice, personal responsibility, and the complex realities of Black masculinity. Caine's choices, while shaped by his environment, highlight the importance of accountability and the tragic outcomes that result when opportunities for change are ignored. This film forces us to grapple with difficult questions. How much of our lives are dictated by circumstance and how much by choice? And how can we break the cycles of violence and despair that continue to plague marginalized communities? What are your thoughts on Menace to Society? Do you believe Caine's fate was avoidable, or was he destined for tragedy from the start? Let me know down below. And thank you so much for listening to Books and Looks TV. I'll see y'all next time.